Hello and welcome to Morningstar Journal News. I am Caleb Havanka and I am here once again with Mr. Nicholas Papanicolaou. We are here to discuss a topic the mainstream media has kind of put on the back burner, and that is the rise of the neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine. So Mr. Nicholas, thank you for joining me today again.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. I want to read something to you. On February 25th, 2022, Vladimir Putin said in a speech, he said, quote, "I appeal to the servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces. Don't let neo-Nazis and Banderites use your children, your wives, and old people as human shields. Take power back into your own hands," end quote. And so I have a two-part question here. Can you just explain what is neo-Nazism and who are these neo-Nazis Putin is referring to?
Yeah, interesting. I think actually, first of all, that his invitation of February 25th to the Ukrainian Armed Forces is very much an artificial thing. It's only partially true, and I even wonder if that is even partially true. But first of all, neo-Nazism. What is neo-Nazism? It's basically what the term means. It's people who believe that the Nazi cause was correct. In other words, a national socialism dictatorship from the right, imposed from the right, and with obviously substantial curtailment of constitutional rights and human rights, etc. So they see themselves in a way as the descendants of the original Nazi regime, which we all know came into power in Germany in the 1930s and led to World War II. Now, are there neo-Nazis in Ukraine? In World War II, this is where real animosity begins between what the Russians call neo-Nazis and the Ukrainians call Ukrainian patriots. What happened in World War II is that when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, there was so much disgust in Ukraine against Stalin. Suffice it to say that pre-Bolshevism in Russia, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the whole world. Anybody who was in the shipping business knew this, because you went to Ukraine to load your ship with wheat or grain or corn and bring it out to feed the world. And then Stalin decimated those farms, those farmers, etc., to the point where actually the Soviet Union became the biggest importer of grain and corn, etc. Those are the wonders of communism. So when the Germans came in World War II, many Ukrainians sided with the Germans because they hated Stalin so much, including the Cossack tribes. The Cossack tribes traditionally had been the backbone of the old Russian Empire. They were very Christian. They spilled a lot of blood fighting against Islamic countries, and they were super patriotic Russians. And so the Cossacks and a number of Ukrainians sided with Hitler because they saw it as an opportunity to get rid of Stalin and the communist regime. And Stalin, of course, never forgave that. He considered them to be traitors. And when, at the end of World War II, the Allies made their famous or infamous agreement with Stalin, where Europe was divided, and Churchill, if you remember, made that famous speech where he said an iron curtain has descended upon Europe, which divided Europe into the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. The countries in the Eastern Bloc, countries like Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria, they wanted to be with the West, but there was nothing they could do because the big allies, Churchill and FDR, had to agree with Stalin's demands that Eastern Europe would be under his control. And part of the deal that was done then among the allies at Yalta was that Stalin hated the Ukrainians so much for siding with Hitler against his own armies that he demanded of the Allies that they return forcibly to the Soviet Union any Ukrainians who had participated in resisting the Soviet armies and had sided with the Nazis. And there is an infamous story, actually, I think it was along the Dnieper River, that the so-called exchange took place, where the Ukrainians were forced by the Allies, especially the British, to cross the river, and on the other side were the Soviet troops, Stalin troops, waiting for them. And Ukrainian mothers and Cossack mothers that started to cross the river in its shallows, they were being forced into the river at gunpoint, were actually drowning their kids in the river and then drowning themselves rather than permit themselves to get to the other side where the Soviets were waiting for them. So at that time, the perception in Russia grew that there were neo-Nazis in Ukraine. But really what they were anti-communists. They were not Nazis per se. They had never dreamed of joining Hitler, but they saw that as an opportunity. And right or wrong, I'm not commenting whether they were right or wrong, that is what happened. So the perception remained with the Russians that in Ukraine there are neo-Nazis. Now, when you look at Ukraine, it is essentially a divided country. And why do I say that? And I'm not talking about recently, it has been like that for some time. Because in eastern Ukraine, you have Russian-speaking people, and you have also Cossack tribes. And in western Ukraine, and it's Orthodox, eastern Ukraine is Orthodox. Western Ukraine, you have descendants of Poles, of Hungarians, of Romanians, etc. And they are much more pro-Western, and also Catholicism, the Vatican had entered in a big way in Western Ukraine. So let's now fast forward to the present time. When Putin makes this accusation of neo-Nazis, the people that he calls neo-Nazis essentially came from the western part of Ukraine. But what had happened since 2014 especially, is that a number of them, reportedly 20,000 alone, of those quote-unquote neo-Nazis had come into Mariupol, which is in eastern Ukraine, and taken it over, and they were actually being pretty brutal with the Russian-speaking population there. Because their point of view, many of them are Catholics, they speak Ukrainian and not Russian. They're very similar languages. For example, in Russian you say Vladimir, in Ukrainian you say Volodymyr. But they're sister languages. So people from Western Ukraine after 2014 moved into Eastern Ukraine, and in particular into the city of Mariupol, 20,000 of them. And the Russians, the local people that were there, viewed them as neo-Nazis. Many of them were Catholic, these people that moved in. They were also, pro-West, and that did not sit well with the traditional Russian communities that existed in Eastern Ukraine. We know from reports that were given to the Greek press by Greek Ukrainians, there are about 8,000 of them who took refuge in Greece once this war started. And they were giving interviews to the TV stations in Greece, and they were pro-Russian, and they were saying it's true that these neo-Nazis, the term somehow stuck, came from Western Ukraine, they came into our city, and they took over the mayor's office and this and that and the other, and they were forcing us to do things that we didn't want. But of course, that didn't make them love what the Russians did to them either, because they had left, obviously, and come to Greece for refuge. But it gives you sort of a flavor for the mixed topography, the tapestry of what exists there. So, now, are these people really Nazis? No, I don't think so. But they don't like the Russians to be on top of them. And that is essentially a problem that Ukraine has between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. And one could argue that it's the same thing, let's say, that happened in the United States after the Civil War, or even before the Civil War. You have the South, you have the North. They had completely different outlooks. One was pro-slavery, the other wasn't. And so it was kind of the same thing there, but this whole situation with the war now has exacerbated that. And it's a complicated tapestry.
So what about militia groups like the Azov Battalion with their symbolism that reflect kind of the Nazi symbols? That battalion I heard reports that they're actually working under Zelensky.
Yeah, there have been those reports, and if you notice that Zelensky talked about them about 3 days ago, and he did not come out and criticize them openly. He just said that, well, the Azo Battalion has been important to us to defend our country, etc., but he did not, offer any criticism of them. The Azo Battalion are tough guys. According to what the refugees from Ukraine said to the media in Greece, they're tough people, they're murderers, and they've been terrorizing the population in eastern Ukraine, which was not, appreciated by the local people there. So that's a fact. There's also been a report that the Azov Battalion, as these rapes by Russian soldiers against, the domestic population have been taking place, and we have, as Knights, we have eyewitnesses, fellow Knights who actually have seen in the hospitals the results of this awful, barbaric tragedy. And there have been reports that the members of the Azov Battalion, because of these rapes, whenever they arrest a Russian soldier, they've been castrating them as punishment. So it's an awful mess.
Yeah. So there's evil on both sides, you're saying.
There's evil on both sides, but the primary evil here really begins with Russia, with the decision that President Putin made. I think it was a very inopportune decision. I think he was misled by his intelligence people and his generals, and he never should have done it. I happen to think that there were other, ways for him to impose. His main demand has been that Ukraine not join NATO, because he sees that as a threat. And given the previous history that I told you that starts from World War II, he sees it, for right or wrong, he sees it as an even bigger threat, because remember that in World War II, many of them had sided with Hitler against Russia. So the main problem starts there, but I do believe that President Putin had other solutions that he could have pursued, but unfortunately, he fell into the old, what I would call sort of the Soviet era kind of tough, barbaric thinking. When I say that, pardon me, that there are other solutions, why, for example, could he not have pursued not diplomacy? Many times I hear diplomacy and I shudder because it's ineffective most of the time it's ineffective. But he could have pursued commercial pressure measures. What do I mean by that? Why, for example, could he not have gone to Germany, which was a big recipient of Russian energy, and France and Italy and so forth, and said, look, we will give you a permanent discount off the international price. The international price is indexed, it's determined by others, so it's an objective standard. We will give you a 20%, let's say, permanent discount off the international price on the energy supplies that we deliver to you for the next 20 years. If you side with us at the United Nations and at all kinds of international fora to demand and impose that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. There were other solutions that he had, but unfortunately, the truth is he was provoked with what was happening there, because remember that over the last 15 months, since Biden became president, 3 or 4 times Putin gave speeches around the world, and he presented that demand. He said, all that we ask is that the Ukraine not become a member of NATO. What did the Biden administration do? First, they said from the White House, they said, well, membership in NATO is really a matter between the applying country and NATO itself. We have nothing to do with it, which is obviously putting ink in the water. It's not true, and everybody knows it's not true. And I believe that served to aggravate President Putin, because he knew that the White House was lying. And then, more recently, when Kamala Harris went to the Munich Security Conference, which was right around when, just a little before the war, this war started, she actually made a flat-out statement to the press that we want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. At which point, I believe, Putin said, oh yeah, on my border? Now I'll show you. So we exacerbated the situation. And let's think about another simple truth. President Putin has wanted Ukraine not to become a member of NATO, and to be reattracted to his side of the world for as long as he's president. But here's the question. During 4 years of President Trump, did he dare do anything? No. Why? Because he respected and feared Trump. But when President Biden came in, and after the debacle in Afghanistan last summer, he thought, this is my chance. I'm dealing with a weakling. These are simple truths. You don't need to be Einstein to figure this out.
So you don't think at all that the neo-Nazi movement within Ukraine had any serious part in Putin's invasion, or that it's even has any serious political or military power in Ukraine?
It had power in some of the cities that they took over. They were taking over the mayor's office, as they did in Mariupol. By the way, what I've said about Mariupol, that there were 20,000 of these so-called neo-Nazis there, maybe that explains the vehemence with which Putin has attacked Mariupol in particular. Notice he didn't attack Odessa like that, he didn't attack Nikolaev like that, which are other cities, or Kiev for that matter, but Mariupol he wanted to pulverize. The full hatred and power of the Russian state was used to level that city because they considered it a symbol of the neo-Nazis. So yeah, the neo-Nazis had some power, and I think that President Zelensky in some ways is beholden to them, like any politician would be, because they are, they have some followers, primarily though, as I say, in Western Ukraine. So they were a factor, but I don't think that anybody could say that they had taken over the government of Ukraine or whatever. I think the pivotal issue for President Putin was that he did not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO.
So my final question is, why do you think the mainstream media has basically hidden this story of the neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine? Because prior to the invasion, there's headlines all over from mainstream media saying how this is such a big threat. This neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine, it's arising, it's becoming more and more prominent, more and more dominant within the country. But ever since the invasion, it's like it doesn't exist anymore, and it's almost like a talking point Putin uses.
Because it's now as if the dice have been thrown.
Okay.
The table is set. And so now the media in this country are going to do everything to support the Ukrainians who need support. These barbarities that have been visited on them cannot be excused. They cannot be excused. So they've silenced that part of the story. But, there's plenty of blame to go around, both with Russia, especially with Russia, but also with Ukraine, and also, as I mentioned before in my reply to you, with our geniuses of the foreign policy establishment. Because if they had mapped out a more cautious and a more realistic future for Ukraine after 1991 that said, we'll see that country remain neutral, we'll support their standard of living, etc., but we'll see to it that they stay neutral, none of this would have happened. And so in many ways, we owe an apology to the Ukrainians for egging them on into this tragedy.
Okay. Well, there you have it. Mr. Papanicolaou, thanks again for your time and for your insight on these complex issues. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure.